On July 3, 1976, in a modest apartment building in Duisburg, Germany, a plumber's routine maintenance call would expose one of the most disturbing criminal cases in German history. Residents had been complaining about blocked pipes, a mundane problem that required professional attention. When the plumber investigated the source of the blockage, he made a gruesome discovery: the pipes were clogged with small pieces of flesh and human organs. The tenant responsible for this horrific obstruction was Joachim Kroll, a quiet, unassuming man who had been living among his neighbors for years. What investigators would uncover about Kroll's activities over the previous 2 decades would earn him the moniker, Der Ruhr Cannibal, the Ruhr Cannibal, and reveal a killing spree that had gone undetected for over 20 years. Joachim George Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, in Hindenburg, Upper Silesia, now Zabrze, Poland, the 8th child in a family marked by poverty and hardship. His father, a miner, had been taken prisoner of war by the Soviet forces during World War II and never returned home, leaving his mother to raise the large family alone during one of the most tumultuous periods in German history. The Kroll family's circumstances were desperate even by wartime standards. Food was scarce, and young Joachim often went hungry, an experience that would later manifest in disturbing ways. His childhood was characterized by severe neglect, malnutrition, and the constant trauma of war. The family lived in cramped conditions, and Joachim, being one of the younger children, often received the least attention and resources. In 1947, following the post-war reorganization of European borders, the Kroll family, like millions of other ethnic Germans, was expelled from Silesia and forced to relocate to West Germany. They settled in the Ruhr area, Germany's industrial heartland, where they continued to struggle with poverty and displacement. This forced migration added another layer of trauma to Joachim's already difficult childhood, as the family had to start over with nothing in an unfamiliar place. From an early age, it was apparent that Joachim Kroll was different from other children. He struggled severely in school, unable to keep pace with his peers academically. Testing would later reveal that he had an IQ of approximately 76, placing him in the borderline intellectual functioning range. This cognitive limitation would profoundly impact his life, making it difficult for him to form normal social relationships or understand complex social norms. Kroll's educational journey was brief and unsuccessful. He attended Volksschule, primary school, but made little progress, struggling with basic reading and arithmetic. His teachers noted that while he was generally obedient and quiet, he seemed unable to grasp even simple concepts. He left school after only a few years, functionally illiterate and enumerate, skills deficits that would follow him throughout his life. The combination of intellectual disability and social isolation created a perfect storm for Kroll's developing psychopathology. He was unable to form friendships with peers who quickly recognized his limitations and either ignored or mocked him. This rejection pushed him further into isolation, where his fantasies began to take increasingly dark turns. He spent most of his time alone, developing an rich inner world that would eventually manifest in horrific ways. His mother, overwhelmed with raising a large family in poverty, had little time or energy to address Joachim's special needs. She died in 1955 when Joachim was 22, leaving him truly alone in the world. Most of his siblings had moved away, started their own families, or wanted nothing to do with their strange, backward brother. This abandonment would prove to be a crucial turning point in Kroll's life. After his mother's death, Kroll was forced to fend for himself. Despite his intellectual limitations, he managed to find work as a toilet attendant and later as a laborer in various industrial facilities around the Ruhr area. His employers generally found him to be reliable, if slow. He would show up for work on time, complete his assigned tasks without complaint, and never cause trouble. To his co-workers, he appeared to be nothing more than a simple, harmless man who kept to himself. Kroll lived in a series of small, sparse apartments, moving frequently around the Ruhr area, through cities like Essen, Duisburg, and Düsseldorf. His living conditions were always minimal: a bed, a small table, a chair, and most importantly, a refrigerator. Neighbors would later recall him as quiet and polite, someone who never caused problems and always paid his rent on time. This unremarkable exterior would prove to be the perfect camouflage for his activities. Despite his outward normalcy, Kroll was struggling with increasingly powerful and disturbing urges. His sexual development had been severely stunted by his intellectual disability and social isolation. He had never had a romantic relationship and lacked the social skills to pursue one. Instead, his sexuality manifested in increasingly deviant fantasies that combined violence, control, and consumption. Kroll would later claim that his first murder occurred on February 8, 1955, just weeks after his mother's death. His victim was 19-year-old Irmgard Strell, whom he encountered in a barn near Ludinghausen. According to Kroll's later confession, he had been walking in the countryside when he saw the young woman alone. Overwhelmed by urges he couldn't control or fully understand, he attacked her, strangled her, and then committed acts of necrophilia. This first killing established a pattern that would continue for over 2 decades. Kroll discovered that murder gave him a sense of power and control he had never experienced in his daily life. The act of taking a life, of having complete dominion over another person, filled a void in his psyche that his limited intellectual capacity couldn't allow him to understand or articulate. What made Kroll particularly dangerous was his mobility and the randomness of his attacks. He would travel throughout the Ruhr area by train and bus, sometimes walking for hours through forests and rural areas looking for victims. His simple appearance and obvious intellectual limitations made him seem harmless, allowing him to approach victims without raising immediate alarm. Between 1955 and 1957, Kroll committed several more murders, though the exact number remains uncertain. His victims during this period were primarily young women and girls who were alone in isolated areas. He would strangle them with his hands, commit sexual acts with their bodies, and then flee the scene. Initially, he left the bodies where they fell, making no attempt to hide them or cover his tracks beyond leaving the immediate area. On June 16, 1959, Kroll's crimes took an even darker turn. He murdered 24-year-old Clara Frieda Tesmer in the meadows near Rheinhausen. After killing her, he removed pieces of flesh from her buttocks and thighs, taking them home with him. This was his first known act of cannibalism, though he would later suggest it might not have been the actual first time. He cooked and ate the flesh, later telling investigators that he did this partly out of curiosity and partly to save money on food. This economic motivation for his cannibalism would become a recurring theme in Kroll's confessions. Living in poverty, he saw human flesh as a free source of meat. His intellectual disability prevented him from fully grasping the moral enormity of his actions. To him, it was a practical solution to hunger and poverty, combined with the satisfaction of his deviant sexual urges. As the 1960s began, Kroll's victim preference shifted increasingly toward children. Children were easier targets, they were more trusting, physically weaker, and less likely to be immediately missed if they wandered off. On March 28, 1962, he killed 13-year-old Monika Tafel in Walsum. He took flesh from her buttocks and thighs, as had become his pattern. The murder of children represented an escalation in Kroll's crimes, though he seemed unaware of this distinction. In his limited understanding, children were simply easier victims. He would often lure them with promises of candy or toys, exploiting their natural trust. His childlike mental capacity perhaps made it easier for him to relate to children, making him seem less threatening to them than he might have appeared to adults. On April 23, 1962, just weeks after killing Monika Tafel, Kroll murdered 12-year-old Patrick Easy in Rees. He strangled her and removed flesh from her body, which he took home and consumed. The frequency of his killings was increasing, suggesting that the intervals of satisfaction he gained from each murder were becoming shorter. Throughout the 1960s, Kroll continued his killing spree across the Ruhr area. The industrial region, with its dense population, numerous forests, and excellent public transportation, provided ideal hunting grounds. He killed on June 4, 1962, Monica Taffel in Breitscheid, December 22, 1966, 5-year-old Alona Hark in Bredany, and continued through the decade with a regularity that should have attracted police attention. What protected Kroll was not cunning or careful planning, but rather the limitations of 1960s police work and the mobility of his crimes. Different jurisdictions investigated what appeared to be isolated murders, not recognizing the connections between them. There was no centralized database, no way to easily share information between different police departments, and no understanding that they were dealing with a serial killer, a term that barely existed in German law enforcement vocabulary at the time. Kroll's method remained consistent: approach victims in isolated areas, strangle them with his hands, commit necrophilic acts, and often remove flesh for consumption. He would later describe the killings in disturbingly matter-of-fact terms, as if discussing routine tasks. This emotional flatness wasn't psychopathy in the traditional sense, but rather a reflection of his inability to fully comprehend the gravity of his actions. On July 22, 1969, Kroll murdered 61-year-old Maria Hetken in Huxwagen. This killing demonstrated that while he preferred younger victims, he would attack anyone he found in a vulnerable position. Age, to Kroll, was less important than opportunity and isolation. As the 1970s began, Kroll's crimes became both more frequent and more reckless. On May 21, 1970, he killed 13-year-old Jutta Rahn in Breitscheid. Her body was found with the now familiar mutilations, flesh removed from the buttocks and thighs. The consistency of these mutilations should have been a clear signature, but without modern profiling techniques, investigators failed to connect the crimes. Perhaps Kroll's most heinous crime occurred on March 8, 1976, when he encountered 10-year-old Gabrielle Puetman in Grafenhausen. He lured the girl to his apartment, strangled her, and then dismembered her body. He kept parts of her in his refrigerator and freezer, and was in the process of cooking what he called a stew, when police would later arrest him. This crime represented a new level of boldness, bringing a victim to his own apartment rather than killing in an isolated outdoor location. The murder of Marion Ketter on July 3, 1976, would prove to be Kroll's final crime and the one that led to his capture. The 4-year-old girl lived in the same apartment building as Kroll in Duisburg. He lured her into his apartment with the promise of candy, strangled her, and began the process of dismembering her body. It was parts of Marion's remains, flushed down the toilet, that caused the blocked pipes that would finally expose his crimes. When the plumber made his gruesome discovery in the pipes of the Duisburg apartment building, he immediately contacted the police. Initially, investigators thought they might be dealing with illegal disposal of medical waste or perhaps an illegal abortion. However, when they questioned the building's residents, one name kept coming up: Joachim Kroll, the quiet man in apartment 10. When police knocked on Kroll's door, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. On the stove was a pot containing a small hand and flesh that Kroll admitted belonged to Marion Ketter. In the refrigerator, wrapped in plastic bags, were more body parts. The freezer contained additional human remains that Kroll had been saving for future consumption. What struck investigators most was Kroll's demeanor during the discovery. He seemed confused by their horror and disgust, not understanding why they were so upset. When asked about the contents of the pot, he replied matter-of-factly that it was a stew he was preparing for dinner. This casual admission revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance and his complete disconnection from normal human morality. Once in custody, Kroll proved surprisingly cooperative. Unlike many serial killers who deny their crimes or attempt to manipulate investigators, Kroll readily admitted to his murders. However, his confessions were complicated by his intellectual disability. He had difficulty remembering dates, locations, and even the number of victims. His sense of time was particularly poor, often conflating events that happened years apart. Over several weeks of patient questioning, investigators slowly pieced together the scope of Kroll's crimes. He would describe his murders in simple, childlike language, often focusing on irrelevant details while glossing over the actual killings. He might spend minutes describing the weather on a particular day or what he had eaten for breakfast, but then describe a murder in a single sentence. Kroll admitted to 14 murders, though investigators suspected the actual number might be higher. His poor memory and the passage of time made it impossible to verify all his claims. Some murders he described couldn't be matched to known victims, while some unsolved cases that seemed to fit his pattern he claimed no knowledge of. As news of Kroll's crimes spread, Germany struggled to comprehend how such horrors could have gone undetected for so long. The media dubbed him Der Ruhr Cannibal, the Ruhr Cannibal, and Der Menschenfresser von Duisburg, the man-eater of Duisburg, sensational names that captured public horror but did little to explain the phenomenon. Psychiatrists and psychologists who examined Kroll found a complex picture. His intellectual disability was genuine and severe, affecting every aspect of his cognition. He had the mental capacity of a child aged 6 to 8 years, though with an adult's physical strength and sexual drives. This created a unique and dangerous combination, the moral understanding of a young child coupled with adult violent and sexual urges. Dr. Heinrich Wilmer, one of the psychiatrists who examined Kroll, noted that he showed no signs of classical psychopathy. He wasn't manipulative, didn't enjoy others suffering in a sadistic sense, and showed a primitive form of remorse, though this remorse was more akin to a child being sorry for breaking a rule rather than genuine understanding of the horror he had caused. Kroll's trial began on October 4, 1979, in Duisburg. The proceedings attracted massive media attention, with journalists from around the world descending on the courthouse. The German public was both horrified and fascinated by the case, struggling to understand how someone who appeared so harmless could have committed such atrocities. The central question of the trial was not Kroll's guilt, his confessions and the physical evidence made that indisputable, but rather his criminal responsibility. Under German law, a person could not be held fully responsible for their crimes if they lacked the mental capacity to understand their wrongfulness. Kroll's intellectual disability raised serious questions about whether he could be held accountable for his actions. The prosecution argued that while Kroll was intellectually disabled, he knew that killing was wrong. They pointed to his efforts to conceal his crimes, his selection of isolated locations for most murders, and his ability to maintain a job and live independently as evidence that he understood the wrongfulness of his actions. They argued that his disability might diminish his responsibility but shouldn't eliminate it entirely. The defense, led by attorney Werner Hinz, argued that Kroll's intellectual disability was so severe that he couldn't truly understand the moral dimension of his crimes. They presented him as someone trapped in a child's mental state, unable to control urges he didn't understand. The defense didn't deny the crimes but argued that Kroll needed treatment, not punishment. The trial featured extensive testimony from psychiatric experts, who presented conflicting views on Kroll's mental state. Some experts testified that despite his low IQ, Kroll understood that killing was prohibited and took steps to avoid capture, indicating criminal awareness. Others argued that his understanding was purely mechanical. He knew killing was against the rules, like a child knows stealing cookies is wrong, but didn't grasp the moral weight of taking a human life. Dr. Reinhard Lemp, a prominent forensic psychiatrist, testified that Kroll's cannibalism was particularly revealing of his mental state. He didn't eat human flesh out of sadistic pleasure or as part of a ritual, but simply as food. This utilitarian approach to cannibalism, Lemp argued, demonstrated a fundamental inability to recognize the humanity of his victims. The court also heard disturbing testimony about Kroll's sexual pathology. Experts explained that his necrophilia and cannibalism were intertwined with his stunted sexual development. Unable to form normal relationships, his sexuality had become focused on complete control and possession, which could only be achieved with dead victims. On April 8, 1982, after a trial lasting over 2 years with 151 days of proceedings, the court delivered its verdict. Joachim Kroll was found guilty of 8 murders and 1 attempted murder. The court determined that while his intellectual disability diminished his responsibility, it didn't eliminate it. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with preventive detention, meaning he would never be eligible for release. The verdict was controversial. Some felt that someone with Kroll's limited mental capacity shouldn't be held fully responsible for his crimes. Others argued that regardless of his disability, the safety of society required his permanent incarceration. The judges acknowledged this tension in their verdict, noting that while Kroll might not be evil in the traditional sense, he was undoubtedly dangerous. Understanding Joachim Kroll requires examining the intersection of intellectual disability, sexual pathology, and environmental factors. Unlike many serial killers who are characterized by above-average intelligence and manipulative personalities, Kroll was genuinely limited in his cognitive abilities. This made him unique among studied serial killers and challenged traditional understanding of such criminals. Kroll's intellectual disability affected every aspect of his cognition. His IQ of 76 placed him in the borderline range, meaning he could function in society with support but struggled with complex reasoning, abstract thinking, and moral judgment. He thought in concrete, immediate terms, unable to fully grasp consequences or understand others' perspectives. His sexual development had been severely disrupted by his disability and isolation. Never having learned appropriate ways to express sexuality or form relationships, his drives became focused on the only form of complete control he could achieve, violence and death. The necrophilia wasn't about degradation or humiliation of victims, but rather the only way his limited mind could conceptualize sexual possession. The cannibalism added another layer to his pathology. For Kroll, consuming human flesh served multiple purposes. It was a continuation of his possession of the victim, a practical source of free food, and possibly a primitive attempt at incorporation, making the victim part of himself. His inability to see this as fundamentally different from eating animal meat revealed the depth of his cognitive impairment. While Kroll's intellectual disability was clearly a crucial factor in his crimes, it alone doesn't explain his actions. Millions of people with similar or more severe intellectual disabilities never commit violent crimes. Understanding Kroll requires examining the environmental factors that shaped his development. The extreme poverty and deprivation of his childhood created a framework of scarcity that influenced his entire life. Growing up hungry during and after World War II, seeing human life valued so cheaply during wartime, and experiencing the trauma of forced migration all contributed to his distorted worldview. The cannibalistic aspect of his crimes can be partially understood as an extreme response to childhood starvation, a pathological hoarding of resources. His complete social isolation prevented any corrective influences on his developing pathology. Without friends, mentors, or involved family members, there was no one to recognize his disturbing fantasies or seek help for him. He existed in a bubble of his own distorted thinking, with no reality checks or interventions. The post-war German society also played a role. In the chaos of rebuilding, many people fell through the cracks. Social services were overwhelmed, mental health resources were minimal, and someone like Kroll, who could work and pay rent, wasn't seen as needing intervention. The very factors that allowed him to hide in plain sight also prevented him from receiving help that might have prevented his crimes. Following his conviction, Joachim Kroll was incarcerated at Rheinbach prison near Bonn, a facility equipped to handle prisoners requiring psychiatric care. His adjustment to prison life was surprisingly smooth. The structured environment, regular meals, and clear rules suited his limited cognitive abilities. For perhaps the first time in his life, he didn't have to struggle to survive or navigate complex social situations. Prison staff reported that Kroll was a model prisoner. He followed rules meticulously, never caused trouble, and seemed content with his situation. He worked in the prison workshop, ate in the canteen with other prisoners, who largely avoided him once they learned of his crimes, and spent his free time watching television, particularly enjoying cartoons and simple comedy shows that matched his intellectual level. Psychiatrists continued to study Kroll during his imprisonment, viewing him as a unique case study in criminal psychology. He participated willingly in these sessions, though his contributions were limited by his inability to engage in complex self-reflection. When asked about his crimes, he would provide factual details but showed little emotional engagement or genuine understanding of their impact. Other prisoners treated Kroll with a mixture of disgust and pity. While crimes against children typically make one a target in prison, Kroll's obvious intellectual disability provided some protection. Most prisoners simply avoided him, viewing him as something between a monster and a child, dangerous but not truly evil in the way they understood evil. As Kroll aged in prison, his already limited cognitive abilities began to decline further. He developed health problems related to his age and years of poor self-care. Prison medical staff noted that he seemed to have little understanding of his deteriorating health, accepting medical treatments with the same passive compliance he showed to all authority figures. On July 1, 1991, Joachim Kroll died of a heart attack in his cell at Rheinbach prison. He was 58 years old and had served just over 9 years of his life sentence. His death was quiet and unremarkable, matching the unassuming facade he had presented to the world for most of his life. There were no final statements, no deathbed confessions, no moments of clarity or remorse. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location to prevent any possibility of his grave becoming a macabre attraction. With his death, one of Germany's most prolific serial killers passed from living memory into the realm of criminal history, leaving behind only questions and the devastated families of his victims. The Kroll case exposed significant weaknesses in German law enforcement's ability to track and identify serial offenders. The fact that he had operated for over 20 years without detection led to major reforms in how police departments shared information and investigated similar crimes. Following the Kroll case, German police began developing computerized databases to track unsolved murders and identify patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. The Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, VICLAS, though developed in Canada, was adopted and modified by German law enforcement partly in response to cases like Kroll's. The case also led to increased cooperation between different regional police forces. Regular conferences were established to discuss unsolved cases and share information about potential serial crimes. The idea that a killer might operate across multiple jurisdictions became integrated into investigative protocols. Training for investigators was updated to include profiling techniques and pattern recognition. While Kroll himself was too intellectually limited to be caught through profiling, his case taught investigators to look for consistent signatures across crimes, such as his specific mutilation patterns and victim selection. The Kroll case became a seminal study in forensic psychiatry, particularly regarding the intersection of intellectual disability and violent crime. His case challenged existing assumptions about serial killers requiring above-average intelligence and sophisticated planning abilities. Psychiatrists studying Kroll developed new frameworks for understanding how intellectual disability could combine with sexual pathology to create violent behavior. This led to improved risk assessment tools for individuals with developmental disabilities who showed concerning behaviors. The case also influenced how the German legal system handled defendants with intellectual disabilities. The question of criminal responsibility versus mental capacity became more nuanced, recognizing that someone could be both genuinely disabled and genuinely dangerous. This led to the development of specialized secure facilities for offenders with intellectual disabilities. The Joachim Kroll case forced German society to confront uncomfortable questions about how it treated its most vulnerable members. The fact that someone with obvious intellectual disabilities could live in such isolation, without support or intervention, led to discussions about social responsibility and community care. The case influenced German popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and films. However, unlike some serial killers who become perversely glamorized, Kroll remained a figure of horror and pity rather than fascination. His intellectual disability and the particularly heinous nature of his crimes, especially those against children, prevented any romanticization. Parents across Germany became more vigilant about their children's safety. The idea that danger could come from the quiet, simple-minded neighbor rather than the obvious threat changed how many people thought about protecting their children. Stranger danger education programs were expanded and refined. Decades after his death, Joachim Kroll's case continues to be studied and debated in criminological and psychiatric circles. He remains an outlier in serial killer research, someone whose crimes were driven more by cognitive limitation than by sadism or psychopathy. Researchers continue to debate whether Kroll should be classified as a true serial killer or whether his intellectual disability places him in a different category. Some argue that the intentionality and planning typically required for serial killer classification were beyond his capabilities. Others maintain that regardless of his limitations, the pattern and number of his murders clearly fit the serial killer profile. The case raises ongoing ethical questions about criminal responsibility and mental capacity. If someone truly cannot understand the moral weight of their actions, can they be held criminally responsible? And regardless of responsibility, how should society protect itself from individuals who are dangerous due to disability rather than evil intent? While much attention has been paid to understanding Kroll and his pathology, it's crucial to remember that his crimes destroyed numerous lives. At least 14 people died at his hands, though the actual number may be higher. Each victim was someone's child, parent, sibling, or friend. Their lives were cut short, their futures stolen, their families left to grieve. The youngest confirmed victim was just 4 years old, the oldest 61. They came from various backgrounds, united only by the tragic circumstance of encountering Kroll at vulnerable moments. Many were children who had simply been playing outdoors, engaging in the innocent activities of childhood when they crossed paths with a predator. The families of Kroll's victims suffered not just the loss of their loved ones but also the horror of how they died. Learning about the mutilations and cannibalism added layers of trauma to their grief. Many families struggled with feelings of guilt. Why hadn't they protected their loved one? Why hadn't they noticed the danger? Some families found a measure of closure when Kroll was captured and convicted. Finally knowing what had happened to their missing loved ones, even if the knowledge was horrific, was better than eternal uncertainty. Others found that knowing the details only deepened their pain. While Kroll killed most of his victims, there were some who survived encounters with him or narrowly avoided becoming victims. These survivors lived with trauma that affected them for decades. Some developed severe anxiety disorders, unable to feel safe even in familiar environments. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when others died. The communities where Kroll operated were also deeply affected. Parents became hypervigilant, restricting their children's freedom out of fear. The social fabric of neighborhoods was damaged as people became suspicious of anyone who seemed different or isolated. The innocent trust that had characterized many German communities in the post-war period was permanently eroded. Unlike some high-profile criminal cases, there are no major memorials to Kroll's victims. Their remembrance has been largely private, held in the hearts of families and friends rather than in public monuments. This absence of public memorial reflects perhaps the particularly heinous nature of the crimes, too horrible for public commemoration. Some families have worked to remember their loved ones through positive action. Several became involved in child safety organizations, working to prevent future tragedies. Others supported improvements in services for people with intellectual disabilities, recognizing that earlier intervention might have prevented Kroll's crimes. The case of Joachim Kroll stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in German criminal history. It demonstrates how intellectual disability, social isolation, and environmental factors can combine to create a perfect storm of violence. It shows how someone can hide in plain sight not through cunning but through appearing too simple to be dangerous. Kroll was neither a criminal mastermind nor a sophisticated predator. He was a damaged individual whose limited cognitive abilities prevented him from understanding the enormity of his actions. Yet this limitation didn't make him less dangerous; if anything, it made him more so, as he lacked the impulse control and moral understanding that might have prevented his crimes. The investigation and capture of Kroll revealed significant weaknesses in law enforcement practices of the time. His ability to kill for over 20 years without detection demonstrated the need for better information sharing, pattern recognition, and understanding of serial crime. The reforms implemented after his capture have undoubtedly prevented other killers from operating undetected for so long. Perhaps most importantly, the Kroll case highlights the importance of social support and intervention for society's most vulnerable members. Had Kroll received appropriate support for his intellectual disability, had his isolation been recognized and addressed, had his disturbing behaviors been identified early, perhaps his victims would still be alive. The psychiatric understanding gained from studying Kroll has improved our ability to identify and treat individuals who might be at risk of similar crimes. While we cannot undo the horror of his actions, we can learn from them to prevent future tragedies. As we study this case for educational purposes, we must never forget that behind every clinical detail and investigative fact are real human beings whose lives were brutally cut short. The victims of Joachim Kroll deserve to live full lives, to grow old, to achieve their dreams. Their memory demands that we learn from this case not out of morbid fascination but from a genuine desire to prevent such horrors from occurring again. The story of Joachim Kroll is ultimately a tragedy on multiple levels: the tragedy of his victims whose lives were stolen, the tragedy of their families left to grieve, and even the tragedy of Kroll himself, whose intellectual limitations and circumstances created a monster. It reminds us that evil can take many forms, including that of a simple-minded man who never truly understood the horror of his own actions. In the end, the Kroll case stands as a dark reminder of humanity's capacity for violence and the critical importance of vigilance, intervention, and support in preventing such violence. It challenges us to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize that danger doesn't always announce itself, and to remember that protecting society's most vulnerable members requires constant attention and care. The blocked pipes in that Duisburg apartment building in 1976 finally exposed Joachim Kroll's crimes, ending a reign of terror that had lasted over 2 decades. But the lessons from his case continue to flow through time, reminding us of the importance of community, intervention, and justice in preventing and addressing the darkest aspects of human behavior. This comprehensive account is based on court records, police investigations, psychiatric evaluations, and historical documentation of the Joachim Kroll case. It is intended for educational purposes in the study of criminal history and forensic psychology. While detailed for academic understanding, this narrative aims to treat the subject matter with appropriate seriousness while respecting the memory of the victims and their families.